Om Tat Sat. Welcome to Gyan Bhakti. We are currently exploring the scripture Mysticism of Srimad Bhagavatam. Commentary is by my Guruji, Swami Jyotirmayananda Maharaj, narrated by myself, Swami Nikhilananda. So in today's satsang, we will be covering the mystical meaning of beheading of Daksha and replacing it with a goat's head and Daksha's yagya. So the colorful story we covered yesterday about the events associated with Daksha's sacrificial festivity has profound mystic implications for an aspirant. Daksha, the father of Sati, represents the ego principle, and Daksha Yagya or Daksha's sacrifice represents the realm of Sakamya Karma or action performed with desire. In this realm, people sacrifice to all gods except Shiva. Shiva is who? The absolute self. They work for wealth, for material success, for fame, things that are going to pass away, but they do not work for realizing the absolute self. Everything is done for the sake of the ego rather than for the sake of the self. Gods are honored because they are the fulfillers of desires, but the one who makes all desires vanish, which is Shiva, is not honored. Thus Shiva is ignored by Daksha. Sati represents the relative intellect which enables a person to become learned or intelligent from a worldly point of view. Even though that intellect helps one to know all types of things about the world, it cannot enable a person to know the self because it is the daughter of Daksha, the ego. Daksha expects that his daughter Sati will always obey him, just as the ego sense in an ordinary person expects to see itself obeyed by the limited intellect. However, on the spiritual path, the intellect eventually turns away from the father ego and pursues Shiva, the absolute self, a process which frustrates the ego terribly. So those of you who are serious spiritual aspirants, do not just consider these stories as stories. Pay special attention to the mystical meaning and try to apply that in our daily life. That is the whole main purpose of the meaning mysticism. We are advancing on this beautiful pure path of righteousness and dharma and spirituality, and human body is an incredible blessing to make it all possible. So let's not waste this great opportunity. Sati's determination to go to her father's house uninvited is symbolic of the intensifying confrontation between the relative intellect and the ego. The intellect, which previously had cared only about I-ness and mine-ness, now starts to question the things that it has always taken for granted. It tries to evaluate the ego itself, something which it had never done before. This is what Sati had to do when she started questioning the real intentions of her father and his anger towards Shiva. In the majority of people, intellect is constantly operating under the influence of ego, and it does not question the ego. The moment an aspirant begins to inquire into who am I, he has initiated a confrontation with the ego. He then realizes that the ego that has been held with such great respect is not really so adorable. Rather, it is insulting for an aspirant to feel that he is glued to the ego and will live and die whirling in the wheels of karma. Thus, the intellect enters into the hall of ego and recognizes that all the grandiose things that the ego has done are defective, because the most important thing in life is lacking: the recognition of the absolute self or Shiva. With this realization, the intellect plunges itself into a process of intuitive transformation, allowing itself to be burnt up in the fire of samadhi or superconsciousness, which brings about a profound change in the mind and causes the individual to emerge as a transformed personality. Then Sati was later born as Mata Parvati. Later, as Srimad Bhagavatam mentions only briefly, Sati incarnates as Uma, the daughter of the spirit of Himalayas. The spirit of the Himalayas implies wisdom. The daughter of wisdom is intuitional knowledge, represented by Uma or Parvati, who eventually marries Shiva. As the intellect confronts the ego, it is assisted by the attendants of Shiva, the forces of dispassion and discrimination. With the help of these forces, all illusions of the mind which go to form the sacrificial hall of Daksha begin to break, and all egoistic values are overhauled. Veerbhadra, a chief attendant of Lord Shiva, who represents Paravairagya or supreme dispassion, brings about the highest form of Samadhi, which is superconscious state, and destroys whatever has not been destroyed by other attendants. When Veerbhadra and the other attendants of Shiva punish the deluded worshippers by plucking out their eyes, noses, teeth, etc., they seem cruel. Yet their actions have sublime implications. If the divine self or Shiva is not adored, whatever you perceive through your senses, then those perceptions are misguided. We see, hear, taste things, but we are not sensitive to the divine essence behind what we perceive. So it's very important to understand that living just at the sense level is never a healthy practice. All human senses have their guiding deities. When Shiva is not adored, all these deities become limited and cramped. But when the divine self becomes the center of our life, all the deities guiding us and our senses regain their original glory. The world is no longer just a field for sense enjoyments, but rather a window to eternity. In other words, the human life gets transformed from the transience of the world process to the heights of experiencing divine communion or spirituality at its peak. Shiva's reviving Daksha by giving him the head of a goat is a mystical satire about egoistic consciousness. The endless assertions of the ego are an insult to Shiva, and eventually the head of the ego must be severed, cut off. In a state of surrender and humility, the ego begins to bleat like a goat, and then Shiva becomes immensely pleased, and the solution becomes apparent. The problem is resolved. So this is the satsanga for today, and tomorrow we will start Dhruva, the boy devotee. So I hope you are enjoying Srimad Bhagavat satsangas. They are full of wisdom, knowledge, and Swamiji's grace of his mystical messages that are like a nectar for each one of us spiritual devotees to make our life productive and to achieve self-realization in this very life. These are the ways through which we get to that journey. This is Swami Nikhilananda. Om Tat Sat.